A very warm welcome, everybody, this Thursday evening. Over the last 3 Thursdays, we've looked at some of the phrases that perhaps would have stopped early listeners in their tracks as they heard the great narratives from the Bible. 3 weeks ago, we looked at the first question that God asks. 2 weeks ago, the first question that humanity asks. And last week, we jumped ahead, as it was Holy Week, and looked at that moment when the 30 pieces of silver were placed on the table in front of Judas. Today we go back to the Old Testament and to a moment in the great narrative of Abraham, formerly known as Abraham. And Abraham was called, chapter 14. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High, and he blessed Abraham, saying, Blessed be Abraham by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and praise be to God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand. Then Abraham gave him 1/10 of everything. And the early listeners would have wondered, would have thought, who is this person? He seems to appear from nowhere in the narrative and then disappears. He's not mentioned again. Many years later, he is mentioned in the book of Psalms. Clearly, the people of Israel somehow held him in their memory. Who was this man who had appeared? We know that he was a king of Salem. That's the old name for Jerusalem. He brings out bread and wine. He's priest of God Most High, and he blesses Abraham. There is a spiritual authority about him, which Abraham recognizes because he responds by giving him 1/10 of everything he has. Many hundreds of years later, there is a man in Jerusalem, the new name for Salem, and there he is sharing bread and wine, and people are saying that he is a king. And there's talk of blessing for the nation and for the world. And there's talk of him being a great high priest who is reconciling people to God. He is doing priestly things. He speaks as one with authority. And people began to think maybe this was who this mysterious Melchizedek was all about. That Melchizedek was in some way foreshadowing Jesus. And the writer of the letter to the Hebrews, especially in chapter 7, speaks at some length and with some excitement about this. This unexpected meeting with Melchizedek, a mysterious visitor who comes and then goes. Perhaps we can ponder 3 things here. First of all, in our lives, there may be moments which seem to make no sense. When something happens, a person appears, a conversation takes place, we're not quite sure where it came from or where it's going to go. As G.K. Chesterton would say, it's as if we look on the wrong side at the back of the tapestry and the threads are all hanging in a confused space. But one day we will see it from the front and all will be made clear. So if we have those moments when we're not quite sure what's going on or why this is happening, let's look forward with confidence to the time when the picture will be complete. Second thing, the story of Abraham, as I said at the beginning, is so big throughout history. And the listeners would have been following that story, hearing what Abraham was doing, the various trials, tribulations, joys and sorrows. And that narrative is a big narrative, a great narrative. But suddenly we see that there is this other narrative, the Melchizedek narrative, which perhaps even is big enough to include Abraham's narrative. But perhaps there is that bigger narrative, the narrative of Christ himself, the narrative of God, and in which our narrative can safely sit. And the third thing is this, is that perhaps we may have Melchizedek moments each day, ordinary things which perhaps take us aback and perhaps speak to us of the things of God, speak to us of that bigger narrative. So this evening, and tomorrow, may we look out for those Melchizedek moments, and let's be thankful that our narrative is caught up in the bigger narrative of God himself. Thank you so much for listening this evening.